All right, so for this lab, we're going to be talking about blood vessels, and lymphatic. So we're pretty much covering the circulatory system. We did the heart last week, so we're going to finish off the circulatory system today. So first, let's start off with our different types of blood cells that are living in our blood. So we have red blood cells and we have white blood cells, termed either RBCs or WBCs. So these are our red blood cells and white blood cells. We only have one type of red blood cell, and those are the erythrocytes. So they're technically called erythrocytes, even though we commonly call them red blood cells. And they are the most common cell in the blood. Okay, so when you look at a blood slide, that's what you're going to see. But we do have a couple different types of white blood cells. So we have 4 different types that we're going to talk about today. There are a few more, and we'll talk about those in lecture. So our first and most common type of white blood cell is our neutrophil. And so we'll see a picture of what they look like, but they have these kind of multi-lobed nuclei. The nuclei kind of look a little lumpy. So we'll talk about that. You can even make little letters out of them. And then we have eosinophils. So eosinophils are very similar to neutrophils, except that their nuclei is a little bit different. It's not as, it doesn't have as many lobes, so it doesn't look as lumpy. And then also the granules inside the cell are bright orange or kind of a pinkish color. And so they're very easy to identify. And then we have lymphocytes, and they're the second most common. They're a lot smaller than neutrophils, but they have a very large nuclei. The nuclei makes up most of the cell. So we'll see some pictures of those guys. And last but not least, we have monocytes. And these guys look a little bit different. They're very large, so they're larger than all the other types of white blood cells. And their nuclei is very distinct. It's like a backward C or kind of a kidney bean shape. So we'll take a look at those as well. And those guys will eventually become macrophages in the tissue. So they're called monocytes in the blood, and they become macrophages in the tissue. And we do have platelets, although they're not cells, they're cell fragments. So we do see platelets in our blood slides as well, and they're very small, way smaller than any of our blood cells. So let's take a look. Let me get my laser pointer here. So if we look, here's our 40x smear. So we kind of see a lot of cells on here, but the majority of them you see are kind of this kind of pinkish color. Those are all your red blood cells. And then spattered amongst those, you see these kind of darker nucleated cells, kind of different shaped, and maybe some are a little bigger, some are a little smaller. Those are our white blood cells. Okay, so let's zoom in on those. So if we take a closer look, and here are those individual red blood cells. Okay, so these guys are the big kind of pinkish kind of reddish cells. Okay, those are all the erythrocytes. And then in amongst those, you see these little kind of purple dots. Those are the platelets. So they are just cell fragments. So they're very small, smaller than the red blood cells. Now, what do some of those white blood cells look like? Well, if we look, here are our neutrophils. So we have 2 neutrophils on the slide. And if you look, the nucleus of each one is very differently shaped, right? There's lots of these lobes or lumps. They look very lumpy. And they're quite a bit bigger than the erythrocytes comparatively. So these are our neutrophils. And if you look in the background of them, those granules are kind of light pink, kind of very similar to the red blood cells. Okay, so those are the most abundant. You'll see the majority of the white blood cells will be neutrophils that you'll see. And let's look at the eosinophil. So that's a little bit different, about the same size as a neutrophil, but if you notice the background, all those granules are really dark, kind of orangish pink. It doesn't look that orange in this picture, but if you look at it under the microscope, it's quite drastic. So very different than the neutrophil in terms of those granules. And also, if you notice, the nucleus is not as lobed, right? This one's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lobes. Maybe this one's got, 4 or 5 as well. This one only has 2 lobes. So very different. So we don't call it as multi-lobule or multi-lobed like we do for the neutrophils. So let's look at our other white blood cells. So if we blow up, here's our original picture again. And if we blow up, there's our lymphocytes. So these guys are lymphocytes. They look a lot darker, a lot more circular than our other white blood cells. So that's these guys here. And if you notice, they're a bit smaller than the neutrophils and eosinophils. And that nucleus takes up almost the entire cell. There's a little bit of cytoplasm kind of on the outside, but that's about it. Okay. And then last but not least, our monocyte. So it's quite large. Okay, so it's the largest of the white blood cells. And the nucleus has that kind of kidney bean shape. This one isn't the best picture of the kidney bean shape. Usually it's a little more curved, like a backwards C or a kidney bean. Okay. So let's review a little bit about the vessels coming in and out of the heart. So that's what we started or finished off with last time with the heart. So let's review a little bit about those guys. Let's go through our arteries first. Okay, so the arteries are going away. So our biggest artery is going to be the aorta. Right, so we have the aorta. It's going to go into the ascending aorta, aortic arch, and then descending or thoracic aorta down the backside, okay, near the spinal cord. And then we talked about those 3 branches that come off the aorta. Our first branch is that brachiocephalic trunk or brachiocephalic artery. Okay, that's going to then give off that right common carotid and turn into the subclavian artery, okay, going to the right arm. And now we have the second branch off that aorta, okay, that's going to be the left common carotid artery, going up the left side of the neck. And then we have the left subclavian artery going to the left arm, okay. And then we'll do the pulmonary at the end because they're a little backwards, remember? But if we look at our veins that are going to be coming back to the heart, so let's kind of start out and work our way back to the heart because that's going to be the blood flow direction. Okay, so up here with the common carotid, we have our jugular, our internal jugular vein. So that's going to come in and join with the subclavian vein coming from the arm, and they're going to both join together and become the brachiocephalic vein. Okay, so I have it labeled on this side. Okay, so brachiocephalic vein. So they're going to be coming in from both sides, subclavian and brachiocephalic and jugular all on the right. They're all going to end up and pool together in that superior vena cava coming back to the heart. Okay, so hopefully that's a good little review. And then the pulmonary vessels are going to be a little bit different. Okay, so pulmonary artery is going to be blue because it's deoxygenated, but it's an artery, so it's leaving the heart because that blood needs to get oxygenated in the lungs and then come back through the pulmonary veins, nicely oxygenated to go out to the body. So now if we continue those vessels, and if we talked about the subclavian artery going out to the arms, that's going to help us, and we're going to start from there and see how those arteries branch. Okay, so we're going to have the axillary artery, which will be the continuation of the subclavian, and then it'll turn into the brachial artery. And then that brachial artery branches into the radial artery and the ulnar artery. This is pretty easy, right? All these words we've seen before in the regions of the upper limb, right? The axillary is kind of the shoulder armpit region. Brachium is the upper arm, right? And then our radius and ulnar, they're going to follow those bones. Okay, so very straightforward. Even easier than the nerves. So if we look at our subclavian artery, okay, if the right side, it's coming off that brachiocephalic trunk. If it's the left side, it's coming right off the aorta. So these guys are going to go down the arm, okay, and as soon as they hit the shoulder, it's going to become the axillary artery. Okay. Then as soon as it hits the arm, it's going to become the brachial artery. Okay. And now if we turn it kind of sideways, here's our brachial artery coming down, and then that's going to branch into the radial artery going down the radius and the ulnar artery going down the ulna. So that's pretty straightforward. So the thing about the vessels, and we'll talk more about this in lecture, is that for our veins, we know that all the veins are returning to the heart. But the thing about the veins is we have both superficial and deep veins. Now the deep veins are really easy to remember because they are named and they follow with the arteries. Okay, so they have the same name as the artery and they follow them. But the superficial veins don't, and so they're a little bit different. So they're up towards the skin. So let's look at those superficial veins. So we have a median cubital vein. Okay, it crosses kind of the anterior side of the elbow. The basilic vein, okay, and the cephalic vein. So we'll look at those and that'll make more sense on the model. Okay. And then we do have two deep veins, okay, the axillary and brachial veins. So again, they follow, so the brachial vein follows the brachial artery, runs in the same area. Same with the axillary vein, runs with the axillary artery. So they are our deep veins. So what can we see on the model? So remember our artery coming in, so our brachial artery coming down and then branching, radial and ulnar, okay? So they don't show those deep veins running with those arteries, okay? So what we do see here, this crossing over here, is going to be the median cubital vein, and it continues up as the basilic vein, okay? And then over here, we've got this other branch, another superficial vein here, following kind of the outside of the arm, and that is the cephalic vein, okay? So these guys are both going to come up and they're going to merge together up in that axillary region. So if we look at the top half, we have our vessels coming up the arm. Here's the cephalic on the outside, our basilic on the inside. And then right in the middle is the brachial artery, and they've cut that brachial vein. So it would be running with that brachial artery. So it would be deep. And then they all merge together onto that axillary vein. And then that cephalic comes all the way up and they merge together to the subclavian vein. Okay, so all these veins are draining the arm and the hand, and they're bringing all that blood back to the heart via that superior vena cava. So now let's look at the whole arm all together. Okay. So if we look at all of our arteries and veins, we're not looking quite at the forearm, but once we reach that elbow region, we have that there's the median cubital there, and it continues as the basilic vein, merges with that brachial vein, okay, up to the subclavian. There's the cephalic on the outside coming up and joining at the subclavian. Okay, and then there's that brachial artery running with that cut brachial vein deep against the humerus. Okay, and then if you're in this region, you become the axillary vein and artery, and then the subclavian vein and artery. So here's what we can see on the forearm. And again, don't worry too much about the veins in the forearm, just the radial artery, the ulnar artery down there, and you know that there are deep arteries or veins running with them as well. But our first superficial vein we see here is that median cubital, okay, crossing between our cephalic and our basilic, those superficial veins. So now let's go to the lower limb. So we haven't really talked about the lower limb vessels yet. So our arteries are going to be the femoral artery, the popliteal artery, which is going to go behind the knee. Okay. And then we do have the posterior tibial artery, anterior tibial artery, and then this dorsalis pedis artery. Okay. So let's look at those. You can probably tell where the femoral artery will be, maybe these two, posterior and anterior tibial artery, and then we'll take a look at those other guys, okay? So if we follow down, we know we have that aorta coming down from the heart, right? And it turns into that descending aorta, thoracic aorta, and then if it's going through the abdomen, it's the abdominal aorta, okay? And then it's going to branch down each leg, okay? And once it hits the hip, it's going to become the femoral artery, okay? So the femoral artery is going to continue down and become the popliteal artery behind the knee. And then once it hits the knee, it's going to branch, okay? So it's going to throw an anterior branch and continue as a posterior branch. So we have the posterior tibial artery coming down. Then we have the anterior tibial artery coming as a branch off that popliteal artery down the front side, okay? And then that posterior tibial is going to continue under the bottom of the foot and around, and it'll be the dorsal pedal. So if we look at the veins of the lower limb, it's going to be very similar. We've got some deep ones and we've got some superficial ones, but we're not going to talk about as many veins as we did the upper limb. So we have the femoral vein, which is going to be our deep vein that runs with that femoral artery. And then we have two superficial veins. So the great saphenous and the small saphenous vein. So again, not as many veins as the upper limb. So we're not doing quite as many vessels on the lower limb. So what do those guys look like? So our femoral vein is going to run with the femoral arteries. You can see those two together right here. Okay, so that is the femoral artery and femoral vein. Okay, now the saphenous, okay, don't worry as much about the small saphenous. It's on that kind of lateral aspect of the leg, and it's going to turn into the great saphenous. Okay, so the great saphenous runs all the way the length of the leg, and again, this is the superficial vein coming all the way up and joining up with that femoral vein up in the pelvic region. Okay, and then they're going to all merge and return to the heart via that inferior vena cava. So if we put it all together, we'll take a look kind of top to bottom of the lower limb. So we'll start with our arteries. So we have that femoral artery coming down, branching off that abdominal aorta, and then that'll continue as the popliteal artery, and then we'll see how it branches underneath. And then up here we've got the femoral vein and the great saphenous vein coming up and joining together and into the vena cava. And then if we look at the leg, so the continuation of those vessels, so we had that popliteal artery coming down, and that's going to turn into the posterior tibial artery. Okay. And then that other branch will become the anterior tibial artery, and that's shown on this side. Okay. And then that posterior tibial artery is going to come around and become that dorsal pedis artery. And then the saphenous, our small saphenous over here on the lateral aspect of the leg, is going to come up around, become that great saphenous that comes all the way up and joins in with the femoral vein. Now, if we look at the arteries and the veins of the thorax, they're going to all run kind of along the spine on the posterior side of the thorax, okay? So the thoracic aorta, we already said, is the continuation of that descending aorta after the aortic arch. So that's pretty, and it's going to throw off some branches to the thoracic cavity. And then in terms of the veins, this is our weird vein, the azygos vein, and it's going to drain all the intercostal areas. So all those vessels that are going out to in between the ribs and all those muscles, those intercostal muscles, they're going to drain all that region and bring it back to the heart. So if we look at the thoracic cavity, we've taken out the lungs and the heart. Here's our diaphragm at the bottom of the screen. Okay, our esophagus running right through the middle of the screen. And then we have a couple of vessels. So here's our thoracic aorta that's coming off that aortic arch, okay, and descending aorta. And then here's our azygos vein, okay. So again, we're throwing off these other branches out here. So these are the intercostal vessels. So they're going to run in between those ribs. So we've got an intercostal artery and vein there. And the azygos is draining all those intercostal veins, okay, coming back to the heart. Now, if we look at the arteries of the abdomen, these can be a little more confusing, but if you think about it, all the organs in the abdomen kind of need a blood supply, right? So we're going to look at all these branches off that abdominal aorta that we talked about earlier, which is just a continuation of the thoracic aorta. So we're going to throw off one big trunk called the celiac trunk. And the celiac trunk is going to deliver blood to the stomach, the spleen, and the liver. Okay, so it's going to branch and become the splenic artery, and then it'll become the common hepatic artery. So it's going to throw off a couple of branches, okay, off that celiac trunk. And we'll talk about the vessels to the liver is very special. But essentially we have a common hepatic artery that branches into the hepatic artery proper. Don't worry too much about that, and we'll look at that in a minute. And then we have the renal artery. So each kidney has its own artery coming off. So you have a right and left renal artery. Same with the gonads. So we have a gonadal artery going all the way down, whether that's to the testes or to the ovaries. Okay. So let's look at our Flatman. So let's orient ourselves a little bit here. The top of the screen we have our diaphragm. So that's going to delineate between the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity. So we have our abdominal aorta coming down, and then it's going to branch to the two legs, and then it's going to send off all of these branches to the organs. So the very first branch up here, and it's just a little nubbin, is going to be the celiac trunk. Okay, so this kind of whole region here is the celiac trunk. It's going to throw off a bunch of other branches. And then one of them is going to be the splenic artery, so it's going to come out to the spleen over here on the left side of the abdomen. And it's going to throw out the common hepatic artery coming out over here, out to the liver, and then it's going to branch into the hepatic artery proper. And that's the liver on the right side. Okay. And then if we follow it down a little bit more, we've got two more branches here out to the kidneys. So the renal arteries are going out to the kidneys. And then we've got our last two branches here going each down fairly long arteries down to the gonads. So either down all the way down to the testes or somewhere in the pelvic region for the ovaries. Okay. And then this just shows you a little bit more about that celiac trunk. Okay, so the celiac trunk is going to give off a couple of other branches. We've got some going to the stomach, okay, the gastric. We didn't talk about that one. So some going to the stomach, some going to the intestines. Then we've got that splenic artery and that common hepatic artery coming off. Okay. So now we have two arteries that we haven't talked about because you might say, well, what about the rest of the intestines? That celiac trunk kind of covers the stomach, but it doesn't cover the intestines. So these are our mesenteric arteries. So you have a superior mesenteric artery and an inferior mesenteric artery. And these guys are going to cover kind of the superior part of the intestines and the inferior part. So we have quite a long intestines, so we have to cover it with two different arteries. Okay. So when we talked about the vessels going down the legs already, right, our femoral artery, but before we get to the femoral artery, that abdominal aorta branches, okay, and that abdominal aorta branches into the common iliac arteries. Okay, and then they're going to continue as the internal and external iliac arteries. The more important one being that external iliac because it's going to continue as that femoral artery. So we're backtracking just a little bit back into the abdomen for where the aorta branches down the limbs. So let's take a look at these again. Okay, so let's orient ourselves again. Here's our abdominal aorta. Okay, and then we know this is that celiac trunk here giving off that splenic artery, the hepatic artery, and then there's this little branch up here, okay, that's going to the diaphragm, and then we have this other branch down here, okay, and that is going to be the superior mesenteric artery. I know it's kind of hard to see on the picture, but you guys can practice looking at the quiz questions for the pictures and what those look like, because those will be the ones I'll use. And then if we follow, we know our renal arteries here and those gonadal arteries. And if you keep going more inferiorly, we have this last branch here, and that's the inferior mesenteric artery. Okay. Now we noticed that aorta branches. So that first big branch is the common iliac artery. Okay, and then it's going to branch again, and that's the internal iliac, and it continues as the external iliac. So the external iliac is going to continue down, and once it hits the hip, that's when it's going to turn into that femoral artery to go down the leg. So we've talked about the arteries of the abdomen. Now let's talk about the veins of the abdomen. So the inferior vena cava is really the thing that is going to drain all the entire lower body. So all these veins are going to merge and come back into the inferior vena cava to go back to the heart. So we have the hepatic veins, they're going to drain the liver. We have renal veins that are going to drain the kidneys, and the gonadal veins. So these are all very familiar, right? So they're going to run with those arteries as well, and they're going to drain all those organs back to the inferior vena cava. And then same with those branches to the legs, right? So we have those iliac arteries, so we're going to have iliac veins. So we've done all the arteries, right, all the red side. So now this big structure, the big blue structure, is our inferior vena cava. So it's going to go all the way back up through the thoracic cavity and into the heart. Okay, so all these are going to be drained into the heart. So first we have these hepatic veins, right, draining the liver. Okay, they're going straight into the inferior vena cava. We have the renal veins coming off each kidney, okay? And then down here, we've got those iliac veins running with those iliac arteries. So first being that external iliac vein, internal iliac vein, they all come together and become the common iliac vein, which will run and become the inferior vena cava. Now the gonadal veins we weren't able to see on that Flatman model, but we can see them here, okay, coming up. This one's a little better, up into the vena cava, okay. So the gonadal veins are a little harder to see on that other model. They don't have them there, so we look at this one. This is our big torso model that we've taken all the intestines out of. So remember I said the liver was very special. So we do have a special vessel system in the liver, and it's called the hepatic portal system. So essentially, we pick a couple of veins from our intestines or some organs that are going to contain a lot of nutrients or possible pathogens, and we shuttle all those veins into the liver. We drain all those veins into the liver first so that the liver can process all the nutrients and possible pathogens before returning it back to the vena cava and back to the heart. So when we talk about the hepatic portal system, the main vein that all this blood is going to be entering into the liver is called the hepatic portal vein. So the hepatic portal vein is very important because it is what is draining these other veins. So we said either it's going to come from something with a lot of nutrients, such as the intestines. So we have both the inferior and superior mesenteric veins because they're draining all that blood from the intestines. And what does our intestines do is they're going to pick up all the nutrients from the food we just ate, and we don't want to waste all that nutrients, so we want to take it to the liver for processing. So those two are definitely going to drain into the hepatic portal vein. And then we also have the splenic vein. So the splenic vein is going to drain into the liver because what does the spleen do? And we'll talk more about the spleen in another lecture. But the spleen essentially filters all the blood. So any sort of pathogen in the bloodstream is going to be filtered out in the spleen. So any sort of pathogen then in the blood is going to go to the liver for destruction, for processing essentially. Because we don't want all those pathogens to go back to the heart, right, and be distributed out to the rest of the body. So we're going to try to filter the blood a couple different ways. So we're going to filter it in the spleen, send it to the liver, and then hopefully by then we've gotten rid of that pathogen before we return all that blood to the heart. Okay. So these three veins, splenic vein, superior mesenteric, and inferior mesenteric veins, all drain into this hepatic portal vein into the liver for processing. So this is just a picture of that, okay? So here's our portal vein, our hepatic portal vein. It's going to drain the splenic vein and the mesenteric veins, or these intestinal veins. And then we're going to go through the liver. Okay, we're going to get processed by the liver, and then we're going to be picked up by the hepatic vein, the true hepatic vein, not the hepatic portal vein, before we go back to the vena cava and back to the heart. So here's just another picture of that I like even a little bit better too, because we're going to pick up both our inferior mesenteric vein, our superior mesenteric vein, and that splenic vein all going through that hepatic portal vein, processed in the liver, Now we're going to go through our true hepatic veins into the inferior vena cava. What does that look like on the model? So the models essentially we've seen so far, we have kind of red for our arteries and blue for our veins. Well, now we're going to introduce another color, and it's kind of this purplish color, and that's going to be the hepatic portal system. So anything that's purple is going to be part of that hepatic portal system. Okay, so here's our hepatic portal vein right here coming into the liver. Okay, so it's going to be draining all these other vessels. Okay, so what does it look like over here on our little duodenum, pancreas, and spleen model? So that's the hepatic portal vein right here and right here on the back side of the model. So that's all going into the liver. Okay. So now the splenic vein is one of them. So here's our splenic vein coming from the spleen, draining the spleen and joining up into that hepatic portal vein. Okay, and then over here we can see it as well. So here's our splenic vein coming in, draining into the hepatic portal vein there. And then our mesenteric veins are a little harder to see on the model. So let's see if we can understand that a little bit better. Okay, so here is our superior mesenteric vein right here. If we flip it over, you can see it coming in here into that hepatic portal vein here. And then our inferior mesenteric vein down here, okay, is going to come in, and it's hard, you can't see it on this model here. You have to turn it to the other side and see it here. Okay. So we have the superior and inferior mesenteric veins, and it's even harder to appreciate over on the Flatman. So here is the superior mesenteric vein coming in, and then over on this side is actually the inferior mesenteric vein draining the other side. So that doesn't help you really with inferior and superior on the veins. Okay, so it's hard to tell that one is like above the other one. Okay, so just kind of memorize it, you know, on the practice quiz pictures, which is which. Okay. So we're going to finish up with the lymphatic system. So a lot of people forget about the lymphatic system, but it's very important in our body because essentially it's a filtration system. So it picks up any fluid that has leaked out of any of the capillaries or the vessels in the tissues, and it brings all of that fluid, and we call it lymph, back to the cardiovascular system. So essentially it picks it all up in the tissues, and it's going to go through a series of lymph capillaries, lymph ducts, things like that, and along the way it's going to hit a bunch of lymph nodes. And lymph nodes essentially just filter the lymph to try to filter out the pathogens in the lymph. So it may have picked up something along the way and you want to filter it out. And a lot of us have probably experienced this. When you get sick, your lymph nodes get swollen, right? Especially those cervical lymph nodes you can feel in your neck. And essentially what happens is it has found a pathogen, and essentially it's battling it in your lymph node. So all your white blood cells are going to go to that lymph node to help battle and get rid of that pathogen. So it's a very common symptom when you get a cold is to have swollen lymph nodes because it's filtering out all those pathogens and battling them. So the spleen we talked a little bit about earlier, it filters the blood. So your lymph nodes are going to filter the lymph and your spleen is going to filter the blood. So they're looking for the same things, right? Any sort of pathogen that does not belong there. So the lymphatic system is really part of the immune system, and we'll talk a lot more about that in our lecture. Okay, but what are the lymphatic things that we're going to look at in lab? So we're going to look at the spleen. So we've kind of seen the spleen already. We're going to see the different lymph nodes in these different regions. So they're named by the region they're in. So cervical, axillary, and inguinal lymph nodes. And then essentially how we get back to the blood is we go through these large lymphatic ducts. Okay, so we have the right lymphatic duct, which is going to drain the upper right 1/4 of the body, and that'll make a little more sense in a minute. And the thoracic duct, which could also be called the left lymphatic duct, but essentially it comes through the thoracic cavity, and it's going to drain pretty much the rest of the body, the entire left and 3/4 and lower part of the body. And this other structure called the cisterna chyli is essentially a lymph sac that is going to drain all of our abdominal organs, okay, especially those intestinal organs. So that'll make a little more sense when we look at the pictures as well. So here's a picture of our lymphatic system. Okay, so the lymphatic system usually is represented in green. Not really sure why, but essentially in these vessels, so we have lymphatic vessels, we have lymphatic capillaries, very similar to our vessels, right, our vasculature, except it's carrying lymph instead of blood. Okay, so all out in the periphery, out in the tissues, you're going to be picking up any sort of pathogens, and all that lymph is going to be drained through all of these vessels, okay? And then the vessels are going to eventually hit a clump of lymph nodes, okay? So whether you're being drained from a limb or from the intestines, you're going to hit some of these clumps of lymph nodes. Okay, and then all of those are going to then drain into the thoracic duct, which comes and deposits the lymph up in a certain area right near the internal jugular and the subclavian, where those veins come together. So that would be the thoracic duct on the left side. Then on the right side, we have our right lymphatic duct draining into the same location, but on the right side of the neck. Okay. So what do they look like on the model? So again, we have our spleen model with the pancreas and the duodenum. So we looked at our hepatic portal system structures on here as well, with that hepatic portal vein, and then those two superior mesenteric and inferior mesenteric veins, along with the splenic vein, all on the back side. So there's our spleen. So we have a specific lymphatic system model. So this is what it looks like, and just to orient yourself here, you can see some of the vessels, right? So this is the veins, so the superior vena cava here, and then you have your brachiocephalic trunk or brachiocephalic vein right here, okay? Then you have your subclavian vein coming in with that internal jugular. Okay, same on this side, subclavian and internal jugular. And then you can see the lungs and the neck, right? The trachea. So just to orient, the heart is missing, okay? Now on this model, the lymphatic vessels are white and the lymph nodes are these little yellow dots, okay? Little yellow lumps. Okay, so if you notice, there's kind of a cluster in the neck, and those are our cervical lymph nodes. And then we have a cluster under the armpit area. Those are the axillary lymph nodes. These are really important for people that are monitoring or have had breast cancer. So the axillary lymph nodes tend to be the ones hit first in breast cancer, or you can monitor those areas. And then you can see this large white structure coming up here, and that is the thoracic duct draining that whole lower right and right part of the body. And it's going to come up and it's going to deposit right into this area, this junction from the jugular and the subclavian vein. And then on the right side, you have the right lymphatic duct draining into the region right here with the jugular and the subclavian. And that way, all that lymph, all that fluid is going back into the blood so that it has been filtered, so hopefully pathogen free, and it goes back to the heart so that all that fluid is back in the vascular system. So now if we look at the lower part of the model, so here's some intestines here. You have an arm and here are the legs. So we're looking at the lower part of this model. And then we have this region here, and these are the inguinal lymph nodes. So they're going to be draining all the legs. So the leg lymphatic vessels are going to come up and drain into these inguinal lymph nodes, which will filter out the pathogens here. And then it's going to continue up into the abdominal region. Okay. Now here's a better picture kind of the thoracic duct. We were kind of looking a little higher earlier, but if we orient ourselves, here is the diaphragm. Okay, here's the diaphragm. Here are the lungs. Here's the stomach. And then if we see, here's that thoracic duct coming right down along the spine. And if you notice, there's a little enlargement down here, and that is the cisterna chyli. So essentially, it's going to drain all the lymphatic vessels from all the intestines. And that's going to all drain into there before it turns into the thoracic duct and drain all the way back to the vasculature up at the neck. All right, and that's it for blood, blood vessels, and the lymphatic system. Definitely check out the model videos as well that I've posted on Canvas. That should help out too. Check out the practice quiz before we have our actual quiz next week. I have taken out the two structures for the fetal circulation, so you don't need to worry about the umbilical artery or veins. So don't worry about those, just worry about what we've gone through today. Okay, until next time, stay safe.